Oh, you betcha. And you know what? I'm really grateful for all of you for your patience as we just kind of work through our technical difficulties. But we got it done just in the, as my daughter used to say when she was a toddler, just in the naked time. So we're all good. So my name is Laura Stewart, and I am currently Chief Academic Officer at 95% Group, and perhaps some of you are familiar with 95% Group. We are a publishing company that publishes resources primarily in the foundational skills, and we also offer professional learning. I live outside of Chicago, Illinois, and I'm really delighted to be here today. I have the opportunity to spend time with my four little granddaughters. I call them my little women. And I have had a long and winding career in education, but I think I've been very fortunate because my passion and my career have really come together. As a matter of fact, I have on the wall of my office, I have a mission statement. I want to be able to contribute in the best way that I can to ensure that all children learn to read joyfully, enabling them to flourish as literate citizens of the 21st century. And I'm guessing those of you that have joined me this morning really share that mission with me, or you wouldn't be doing the work that you do. And I applaud and thank you for the work that you do every day. I know it's not the easiest of work, but thank you for doing this work. And I'm really honored to be able to support you in that work. My latest contribution has really been in the area of literacy and leadership. And so I've written this book called Courage to Lead Literacy. And this is really what the presentation is based on. And so I have a QR code here for you if you'd like to download the entire book. You have the handout slides for the presentation today, which really highlights some of the key aspects of the book. You know, the first section of this book is really about literacy leadership, and I'll be talking about that today. The second part of this book is about implementation science and the phases of implementation, which we'll be briefly overviewing today. The third section of this book is about some kind of other key big ideas around literacy leadership, including some words of wisdom from some people that I've learned from, some people that I consider courageous leaders, and some profiles of some different school districts that have made some changes, some transformative changes through implementation science. So if you want to download this text, feel free right here. Otherwise, you can download it from our website as well. It's a free download for you. All right, with that in mind, let's just dig right in. So, in the book, I define what I mean by a courageous literacy leader, and as you look at this, I'm sure you'll see yourself in this. First of all, a courageous literacy leader understands that literacy is the foundation for our students' success, both in school and beyond. Literacy really is the gateway to what our students will be learning, in school, but also really is the gateway to their success. And really, as a literacy leader, we cultivate that vision for literacy excellence, not literacy competence, but literacy excellence. I always say to people that I really want our students, my goal, my dream for all of our future citizens is that they are able to reap the benefits of a literate life as I have been able to. And therefore, we want literacy excellence for all of our students. And this really requires us to have a culture of collective problem solving and a teamwork approach in our schools and in our districts, and to make sure that we're not operating in silos. And of course, also the recognizing that all really does mean all. I think about knowing what we know, that with the right instruction at the right time, 95% or more of us can learn to read. And, if we're not there, if we're here in our schools and districts, this is the gap of opportunity, right? That we really can strive for all. And we have to believe and hold that in order to reach our goals. And sometimes that means we have to engage in transformational change. And that transformational change sometimes involves a fundamental shift in our values and beliefs and assumptions. I've done a lot of work in the years in my career with really working with leadership in asking some pretty bold questions and getting us to really think about what do we really believe about children and how they learn and what our leadership really needs to ask of us. And many times leaders will say to me, the fundamental question we need to ask is, what do we really believe about children and their ability to learn? Do we have the will and the skill to lead and believe that all children can learn to read? So, literacy transformation is hard work, and it really does start with this collaboration. And it really is based on implementation science. I recently wrote my most recent book is a book called Science of Reading 3.0, and I'm going to give you a QR code to access this book at the end of the webinar. And this book is really about moving us into what I consider kind of the next phase of science of reading. And I believe the next phase of science of reading is about bringing together multiple sciences. Because I do believe when I look at the science of reading movement and how far we've come, just recognizing there is a research base on which we can base our work, I do believe one of the next moves that we need to make as a science of reading community is really integrating multiple sciences. And of course, one of those sciences is implementation science, because I do believe we've encountered some blockers, perhaps, or some challenges that block our way from moving the research to practice. And I'll talk about those in a moment. And I think implementation science, which really doesn't come from education, it spans different disciplines. But implementation science, I think, holds some keys to help us understand how to overcome some of those challenges. So implementation science, which I'm sure many of you, if not most of you, are familiar with, it really is just understanding the research base of the methods that help us, enhance an adoption or implementation or sustainability of an intervention or an initiative. And it really is designed, again, to give us this research base to help us bridge research to practice. And when I think about some of those blockers or those challenges that I have experienced, in my own career, I could kind of, put them into six buckets. And I do believe that these are the six things that tend to keep us from really implementing the research into practice. And the first is just what I call misalignment. And that's where we continue to use misaligned practices that just don't meet the needs of our students. And I've seen this over and over again, where we continue to use practices that just aren't supported by the evidence. The second is what I call integrity, and that's where we maybe adopt a program or we adopt a practice and we don't use it with integrity. Now, I don't use the word fidelity because I don't, fidelity sometimes to me implies, focusing too much on a program. Integrity means that we're using the program with the focus on the student, right? You know, a resource, a curriculum resource, for example, should be adopted with a focus on the student. How does it serve the instruction that serves the student? And that's using the program with integrity. But oftentimes we adopt a resource or we adopt a particular practice and we don't use it with integrity. So I think that's it's something we need to look at when we think about translating research to practice. This one, when I share the third, number three, many people go, oh yes, we understand this. And that's putting too many initiatives at play at once. Oh, this year we're going to, implement the science of reading. Next year, we're going to adopt a new math program. Oh, mid-year, we're going to, put in a social emotional program. Like too many things going on at once, right? So how do we, not put sustainability at risk by having too many things going on at once? Number four, that I think blocks research to practice is if we don't recognize that we have to move things to scale. So oftentimes, I think we have islands of excellence. So we might have a classroom in a grade level that's, doing great things. How do we scale that across the whole grade level? Or we might have a grade level in a school that's doing, moving the needle for their kids. How do we scale that across the school? Or we might have a school in a district that is really moving the needle. How do we move that to the whole district, etc. You know, how do we move from, states that are having great outcomes to the nation? Like, how do we move from islands of excellence, right? Um, Ongoing professional learning and coaching, critical to move from research to practice. And finally, and I think those of you who are listening in, tuning in to this morning, recognize this. If you're in a position of leadership, if you've been, really focused on management tasks, um, really making sure that we're investing in you and growing you as a leader is a really critical piece in moving from research to practice. So implementation science is really critical, looking at the factors that help us move. And this was in an article on perspectives in language and literacy from the International Dyslexic Association several years ago now. And it really looked at the research on implementation science, which again didn't really originate in education. It really originated in the health field and medicine field of medicine. And it really says, look, if we don't, look at the implementation science and look at implementation teams and getting the understanding the factors of implementation science, it could take us, 17 years to move an initiative 50%. But if we put all those things in place, we can move an initiative 80% in 3 years. Okay, I'm going to go with that. That sounds like a good plan. So what do we need to know? Like, what do we need to know to put into place? Well, this is a little equation that helps me, kind of understand the factors to put into place for implementation science. So let's go through this. It's a multiplicative equation, by the way, which is familiar to most of us because it's like the simple view of reading, right? So let's start with what do we want? What's our goal? What's the end game? So our end game is what's our socially significant outcomes? What do we want? Well, I would say we all want educational equity. We want literacy for everybody. Okay? All means all. What does that mean? Well, we have to put into play effective practice. We need evidence-aligned instruction. Follow the evidence. We need effective implementation. That means support to implement that effective instruction. Enabling context, what that means is we need to have an environment or a setting that supports those evidence-aligned instructional practices and those supports, right? Let's drill this down a little bit further. Evidence-aligned instruction is principles of instruction and effective resources, right? The tools and the instruction. And effective implementation, things like putting in an implementation team in place, having the right systems and professional learning and ongoing coaching. And I'll unpack those for you when we get to the phases of implementation. Environment and setting is really very influenced by literacy leadership, by leadership moves, which we'll talk about as well. So let's put some numbers behind this. Let's pretend like let's take my school, Laura's school. And let's see if Laura's school is compliant in these different areas, okay? And let's think about this like simple view of reading. So effective practice in Laura's school. How are we doing? Well, we have adopted the evidence-aligned instruction. We're all in. But effective resources, we're still using some of our curriculum materials from long ago when we were a whole language school. So I'm going to give us about a 80% compliance in this factor. Okay. Effective implementation. Yes, 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 all in, except, we got professional learning, but we're not doing coaching because it's just too expensive. So I'm going to give us about a 50% compliance on effective implementation. Literacy leadership at Laura's school. Yes, we've got good leaders, but we do have a turnover issue. We've got a lot of turnover with our leadership. So I'm going to give us about a 60% compliance on that. All right, you get where I'm going on this, right? So if you do the multiplication, we have about a 24% chance of effectiveness of reaching our socially significant outcomes. So the big takeaway really here is that we do have to be all in on these factors that lead to a successful implementation. And that's really what the implementation science is showing us, is that these are factors that are critical for implementation success. And that, combined with science of reading and the science of learning and the science of teaching, I think really gives us a full picture of how we move research into practice. Okay, All right, so we're gonna keep moving. We have got to keep a perky pace this morning. I know we have limited time together. So in your Courage to Lead book, and also in your slide handout, you'll see this little graphic. And this little graphic is designed to just showcase the implementation journey over a series of phases. Depending on what source you look at, you'll see these phases. Most phases there's 4 phases of implementation. I stretch it out to 5, just simply because I think sustainability should be its own phase because it's very important, I think, um, to really look at sustainability. I tend to have seen in my experience that oftentimes an initiative will be chugging right along, everything's going great, but the minute a champion leaves or the minute a new initiative comes into play, the whole thing can fall apart. So I think we have to put deliberate intention behind building sustainability so that an initiative will continue to last over time. So this is designed to just say, hey, there's a little bit of a roadmap here that we know from implementation science. There's milestones along a roadmap, but the roadmap is not linear. It's not without its detours. It's not without its ups and downs. So that's really what this graphic is designed to show. So along the bottom are the phases of implementation. And this graphic, this little slide here, is designed to kind of, dig a little deeper into what are those phases: exploration, installation, initial implementation, full implementation, and sustainability. And notice across the bottom that this journey takes us, from 2 to 4+ years. And it really depends on, where we start and where's our sense of readiness. Where are, we as a school community, ready for change? So all of these things really factor into how long it might take us to to reach our goals. So for example, if our implementation is adopting a new program, let's say we are adopting a new foundational skills program. I'm going to use that because that's what we at 95% do. And it might take us 2 years, to implement really fully a new program. However, if we are doing a more systemic implementation, for example, rolling out a full literacy transformative program that involves multiple factors, it might take us 4 or 5 years. So the phases of implementation and the length of implementation is really dependent on the scope of the transformation. Okay, I hope that makes sense. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to take a look at each of these phases, and I'm going to just highlight for you some of the what I call courageous leader moves in each of these phases. And the courageous leader moves are um, more detailed in the book. In our time together today, I'll just highlight a few of these courageous leader moves, and then give you some opportunities, even in this brief time, to reflect on these and also to hopefully ask some questions and just ponder these ideas. All right, so the first phase, as I mentioned, is the exploration phase. So here are some big ideas around this exploration phase. So as leaders, as courageous leaders, we need to be clear on the scope of the initiative and really think about what transformation involves during this exploration time. That's where we begin with the end in mind. What do we want at the end of this initiative? And we have to elevate the need for change. This involves gauging the readiness of our school community, because change really does occur in the context of our community. This is where we as leaders start to create an implementation team. And with our team, identify goals, desired outcomes, but also what might get in our way. How do we anticipate barriers to the implementation so that we can head those off? For example, is there going to be a financial barrier? Is there going to be simply resistance to change? Is that going to be a barrier? This is also where we think about what's our communication plan. And finally, how do we think about what's the overall vision and how are we going to, create that shared vision? So let's kind of elevate a couple of these, and I want you to think about how do you elevate the need for change, which will spark a new initiative. So if you want to just think about that for a moment and drop something in the chat, what are some ways that you would elevate the need for change when you think about a literacy initiative in your school or district? What are some things that you would need to elevate to get people to think about change? Yeah, so looking at data, thank you, Kim. Looking at data, boy, everybody's writing that down. Yeah, looking at school data. Somebody else wrote research, looking at data. Beverly, thank you. Yeah, sharing successes. Yes, Turner, reflecting on our core beliefs. Looking at, yeah, observations. And I'm guessing that observations mean observations of things that are working, things that aren't working. Data, yes, includes not just our student scores, but also family and student interviews. Right, exactly. What are our current, thoughts and reactions to our literacy programs? Exactly. Good. Those are all excellent things. Um, yeah, family and community. Yeah, conversations about the needs, the right people in the room, getting input from everybody. Absolutely. Aaron, thank you for mentioning community members. One of the things about implementation science that's really clear is we have to involve the community, the school. And when we say school community, we don't just mean in our buildings, right? We also mean the community at large. One of to me, one of the untapped um, community bodies of community members is our school boards, and making sure that we're educating our school boards around when we think about, for example, the science of reading and what should we be looking for, what should we be rallying behind, making sure that we have an educated community, an educated school board, discerning members of our community and our school boards so that we are really rallying support for the efforts that we're making. Our community, I always say this, our community wants us to be graduating our students who will be citizens of the community that will want to be contributing and staying in the community. And so how do we make sure that the community has a real voice in what we're doing in our schools? So thank you for adding that to the conversation. All right, great, wonderful. Thank you for all those ideas. All right. So yes, elevating the need for change. I think those are all excellent ideas. And I would also say that sometimes data is not the only thing. So all of those things combined, I think, are really critical. One of the things that I mentioned in the exploration phase is the idea of a vision. And, I'm a big fan of, I don't know if any of you know John Maxwell's work, but I'm a big fan of John Maxwell. I find I've read many of his books. Of course, he's written like 95 books or something like that. But, one of his quotes, he says, the success of a vision is determined by its ownership by the leader and the people, right? And he talks about this a lot. And I think you can never underestimate the power of a vision. I mentioned in this book, at the third part of this book, the last third of this book is really kind of words of wisdom from some different leaders. And one of the people we interviewed was Louisa Moats, and I'm sure all of you know Louisa. And she mentions, in her words of wisdom, cultivate a vision and hold that vision, protect that vision. And so I never underestimate the power of keeping, holding, and repeating a vision. All right, great, wonderful. Let's move on to our next phase, which is this installation. So we've kind of explored, and set the tone for starting this implementation. And the next part is this installation. So let's talk about some courageous leader moves in the installation phase. So this is where we as leaders, kind of have to gauge, is everybody in the same boat? Is everybody in the right seats? Are we all rowing in the same direction? And sometimes we have to, make some adjustments, making sure we're on the same boat. Are we all in the right seats? What do we need to do? Maybe make some moves. Um, and this is where we start to really build our plan. Are we creating a literacy plan? And the scheduling, the timing for literacy instruction is really critical when we think about our literacy plan. One of the things that I know we've been paying a lot of attention to as a whole literacy community is our adolescent literacy and our middle schoolers and our high schoolers, and sometimes creating a plan for our our adolescent learners to get the adequate time they need to perhaps fill some gaps is a challenge. So how do we think through creating the time and the space that all of our learners need for literacy instruction? Making sure we have the right assessments so that we have data. Many of you put in the chat that data is critical to driving the need for change. So do we have the right assessments in place to give us the data that we need, not just to elevate the need for change, but also to provide the data that we need to show us if our instruction is moving us in the right direction. And of course, in the installation phase, we want to keep that vision at the forefront, right? Keep it rolling, keep it in the forefront. All right, so let's talk about literacy planning and let's talk about assessments. So when we think about literacy planning, this is in your Courage to Lead book, we want to keep ourselves coherent and focused. So a few key points to think through. Oopsie, sorry about that. First of all, we have to act with a sense of urgency because when we think through, even though I said this is a 2 to 4+ year, rollout, there is a sense of urgency, especially when we think of our students with significant gaps, and especially when we think of our older students. So when we think about our planning, obviously, our multi-tiered systems of support has to take front and center. I know that I mentioned adolescent literacy, and we do have to think about how do we put into place a multi-tiered systems of support for our secondary students. So in the Science of Reading 3.0, which I mentioned I'll be giving you a QR code for, we do have a section on adolescent literacy and implementing MTSS for middle school and high school. And it really is important that we think about what does that look like and how is that different from an MTSS model in an elementary school. I'm wondering if some of you are going to be uh, participating in the Reading Isn't Optional book study program that the Reading League is doing this over the summer. So that book is just came out. Reading Isn't Optional. It's a book about adolescent and secondary literacy. And I was fortunate enough to be able to contribute a chapter to it. It is published by Solution Tree. I see that. Marilyn, yay, she is. And Karen is wonderful, wonderful. Yay, thumbs up. Um, and Jeannie Schaaf is the one that edited that book. She's the one that actually contributed the article to this Science of Reading 3.0 as well. So that book it's a terrific resource. And it does talk about, how do we put into place? I know Kim St. Martin wrote the chapter on MTSS with our adolescent learners. So there's a great resource for you there. When we think about MTSS, how do we make sure we're including enrichment and extension groups in our MTSS model? The one person that is always keeps me honest about our enrichment and extension groups is Nancy Young. And Nancy Young wrote an essay in this book about our advanced readers and how do we keep them in mind? Because so many of us in our work, myself included, have focused a great deal on our intervention students. And she always reminds us that we have to include enrichment and extension students as well. So how do we utilize our strong specialist with students who need the most time, intensity, and focus of instruction? And finally, make literacy scheduling a priority so that students have the instruction that they need, and making sure that if that necessitates a walk to read model or a walk to intervention model, that we carefully put that into consideration. So when we think about time, intensity, and focus, what I'm really referring to, obviously, is the tier of instruction model. Now, I know we're all familiar with this, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but this is just a graphic that helps us remember that tiers of instruction are not students, tiers of instruction are instruction, and that as we deliver core instruction to everyone, what that means, of course, is core does not mean whole group. Core instruction is whatever configuration will get us to meeting the needs of about 80% of our kids. So core instruction, oftentimes, to me, is delivered in a combination of whole group and small group. Rarely can we meet the needs of 80% of our kids in just a whole group model, right? So core instruction is designed to meet the needs of 80% of our kids. So whatever that model looks like, that's our goal. But then, of course, there are going to be students who need intervention, which is simply more time, intensity, and focus of that instruction. And then we will have some students who will need more intensive time and focus of instruction in order to meet those goals, right? So what that looks like, of course, in the instructional cycle is that we deliver that high quality evidence aligned tier one instruction to everybody, again, in whatever configuration we need to meet the needs of the vast majority of our students. And from that, we identify our students at risk, or also, as Nancy Young reminds us, extension and enrichment. And we determine what are those individual needs for those students who need more in time, intensity, and focus. And we deliver that plan and we monitor their progress and we make changes or continue the plan, right? So this is a lovely just graphic that I've, borrowed over time from Deb and Deb Glazer and Jan Hasbrook. And this, of course, is just where we fit in and understand how the assessments work. And obviously, from all of our students, we want to screen. The screening, to me, is a critical feature of not only identifying the students at risk or in need of enrichment, but it also helps me put a mirror to my instruction in tier one. Are we meeting the needs of 80% of our kids, right? If not, we might have a tier one issue. And then, of course, once we know the students are at risk, we simply can't deliver instruction until we diagnose, like what do they need? We can't pinpoint instruction until we use a diagnostic that really helps us pinpoint and group our students. And then, of course, we don't know how they're doing until we use a progress monitoring. But again, progress monitoring is less about the kids. It's more about my instruction. Is my instruction working? Right? Am I doing what they need in my progress monitor? And my progress monitoring, again, shows a mirror. It's a mirror to show me if that's working. This is in your Courage to Lead book, and I won't spend a lot of time on this, but this is really just designed to say, so here's what you need, right? And this just gives you an analogy with a medical model, you know, that universal screeners are kind of like taking your vital signs. And if your vital signs show that, oh, something might be amiss, then you have to have additional testing or imaging. That's what your diagnostics are. Your progress monitoring, it's like an intermittent testing, right? And then your outcome evaluations are like just checking your overall health. Now, when I show this chart to people, sometimes they say, oh, Laura, we don't do progress monitoring every 1 to 3 weeks. So I want to just do a little explanation of that. So if you are teaching some very discrete foundational skills, so for example, let's say you are doing rounds of very discrete phonics skills, and you're teaching something like, vowel teams, and you're doing very pinpointed, targeted instruction in small groups, you can, you want to easily progress monitor every 1 to 3 weeks because that's a very, very discrete skill, right? So please don't get too concerned about that. Please know that that's really designed to accommodate if you're doing very, very discrete targeted skills. Okay. So this is really, again, designed to say, look, this is what we need to think through as we think about different types of assessments. And what I find in this phase is oftentimes people say, ooh, we either don't have the assessments we need, or we have too many assessments that give us too much superfluous information that don't help us drive database decision making. So we're just going to take a pause here, and you don't have to put anything in the chat, but just take a pause to reflect for just a moment, and think about um, if you have the assessments that you need. We're just going to take just a little 1 minute pause here. And I'm just going to check the chat, see if we have any questions. And I'm going to take a drink of water. Thank you, Beverly, for putting in the link to the Reading League. That's awesome. Oh, Kim, that's a great question. So Kim asked the question, um, districts that have administrators on different pages on what assessments to use. I do think that's a courageous conversation, that I think you have to have. And that's part of this whole, implementation. As you go through an implementation, you really do have to have a courageous conversation around what assessments to use. And I would say you have to come to the table and you have to look at in each of your buildings, you have to say, what data are you using and how is it driving your results? And I think you have to come to the table and each person kind of show, what are you using? What process are you using with the assessments, and how is it driving decision making? And just share with one another how that process is working. So, and I also think every administrator has to share what screening and what progress monitoring, and what diagnostics and what progress monitoring they're using. So I think there just has to be an opportunity for everybody to share the process and the main assessments, screening, diagnostics, progress monitoring, and the results they're getting. If anybody else has other ideas, please put it in the chat. But I think that has to be a definite topic for a roundtable discussion. Yeah, Catherine, that's like I said, that's one of the questions I get a lot. We just have too many assessments, um, and that really gets in the way of instruction. So I would encourage you to again have, you know, devote some time to that. That in and of itself is is what I would call an initiative, where we take a time over the course of a year to put that into play, an initiative of examining assessments. What data do we need? What are our goals and outcomes? And how do we pare it down to get just the assessments we need? Um, there are a lot of assessments out there. And one of the things I think that can be done is you can look at do you have some neighboring districts? Do you have some schools within your district that have pared down what they're using? And again, what is their process? What are the assessment tools they're using? And what are the outcomes they're getting? So I think it has to be part of that process of sharing and discernment. Okay. These are all courageous conversations, but we have to lead through these things. Okay, so let's move on to our next phase, which is initial implementation. So initial implementation is where we're really, starting to move the innovation and the intervention on a widespread basis. So during this phase, this is where we have to have this collaborative problem solving around data. If we haven't already put this into place, this is where we're going to use those assessment tools. And this is the process that I was just talking about. Also, if we haven't already put into place professional learning for everybody and coaching for everybody, it's really important. Also, if we have our curriculum resources in place, making sure that we are using those effectively, and we're continuing to lead the vision. So let's take a look at a few of these. So this is the process, and this is actually taken from an article that Stephanie Stoller and I wrote in Perspectives a couple of years ago now. So this is nothing new. This is nothing revelatory. This is just designed to say, look, in a collaborative problem-solving model, we assess, analyze, and instruct, and it's a circular model. So we assess using those universal and diagnostic assessments and progress monitors. So wherever you are in that cycle. So it starts with the universal, and then from the universal, you diagnose, and you create the instructional plan and group for students, and you teach with precision and utilize effective resources. Then you progress monitor, create the instructional plan, group students, teach with precision, utilize effective resources, and on and on and on. Okay. The piece that when Stephanie and I wrote this article, the piece that we agreed is the most often overlooked is the analyze part. And it's really important that when we think about the analyze part, that we are able to have a data system. And I want to emphasize the word system here. This is a system that we are, doing this together. We're doing this in a collaborative problem solving model that especially if we are doing this, in a group setting, hopefully in some sort of a data room where we can share the data across grades, at least across classrooms, if not across grades, so that we're really looking at the students as our students, not Miss Stewart's students and, Mr. Ragsdale's students and Miss Goodwin's students. Like these are all of our students together so that we're really seeing this as we're all invested in this. Yeah. And this is also this process, I think, will also help us with that question that a couple of you asked. What if we have too many assessments? What if we don't have the right assessments? If we do this together, I think this is a time when the process reveals if we have the data that we need, or if we have too much data or not enough data, right? So how do we put into place a process, and how do we do it in a collaborative problem-solving model? So that's where this is where we as courageous leaders, put this into place. Okay, so that's one thing that we put into place in this phase. Another place is professional learning. So when we think about, professional learning, I mean, there's data around what works in professional learning. Linda Darling Hammond and colleagues have done a wonderful publication around, the data around what works in professional learning. It must be collaborative. It must be based on application as opposed to just research, et cetera, et cetera. I put this into our Courage to Lead book because really what I think is important is we're trying to, as leaders, build a culture of curiosity and learning. One thing that's wonderful about our profession, I believe, is that it's a profession of inquiry and curiosity and learning. I've obviously I'm old, people, and I started teaching 100 years ago, and I started out as a whole language teacher. So that tells you a lot. But obviously, if I weren't in a profession of curiosity and learning, I'd still be teaching based on faulty principles of learning. And so thank goodness we are a profession in which we continue to grow and learn. And so professional learning is a huge part of that. I went to teacher preparation so long ago, right? Professional learning is critical to ongoing learning and growing in our profession. So our professional learning, as leaders, we need to make sure that we're meeting these goals. Is our professional learning evidence aligned? Is it based on current research and practice? Do we have training and coaching? Um, is it for all? Is it consistent? Is it for everybody? Because every teacher is a reading teacher, right? All of us, K-12, pre-K through 12, we're all reading teachers. Um, is it ongoing? Is it long-term? Do we have communities of practice? It doesn't happen in isolation. It's not a one and done. And if we're leaders, are we studying and learning alongside of our teachers? Because we have to understand those evidence-aligned practices. Maybe we don't need to know everything that's below the surface of the iceberg, but we have to know what's the iceberg. Yeah, we have to know enough. All right, real quickly in the chat, just drop me something here in the chat. Why is coaching so important? Just drop me something in the chat here. Why is okay, it gives you a partner to explore understanding, teacher support, feedback. Yes, leads to implementing professional learning, reflection on practices, curious, yes, continuous improvement. When you know better, you do better. Sounding board, sharing thoughts and ideas. Absolutely. Supporting district and building initiatives. Boy, it sounds like you've all been beneficiaries of coaching, learning and doing together. Right. So across disciplines, whether you're an athlete, whether you're whatever field you're in, yeah, partnership, large effect size. Yes, Catherine, thank you. We get large effect sizes from coaching. Exactly. Embedded support. Absolutely. Good, good. So some of you might be familiar with this gentleman, Atul Gawande. And Atul Gawande, he wrote the Checklist Manifesto, and he also wrote an article for the New York Times. I believe is either called The Coach in the Operating Room, or that's what he really wrote about. He's a world-class surgeon, world-class physician, and he wrote about his own experience, about how he, in his field, was finding himself, even as a world-class physician whom everybody looked at, he was getting great results in surgery. He really was at the top of his game. And what he found is that he had kind of plateaued and he wasn't really advancing his practice. And what he found is that he needed a coach. He went back to his one of his professors, and he had his professor come in and work with him and coach him. And he basically wrote this article saying, look, no matter how well trained people are, few of us can sustain our best performance on our own. That's really where coaching comes in. So coaching is critical. And one thing I have found in my experience is that many times people with the first thing to go when they look at investments sometimes is coaching. And yet coaching is probably one of the most valuable investments that we will ever make. So as leaders, I encourage you always, always, always to invest in coaching. The other thing that during this phase we have to think about is what resources are we investing in? Because I really think that resources or tools that we put in our teachers' hands really helps us bridge knowledge and practice, or what I like to call the science and the art of teaching. And I want us to hold high standards for resources. I work for a publisher of resources, and I say, look, hold high standards, ask questions, ask of your publishers, are the resources that you're publishing both evidence aligned to the body of research in whatever discipline that would be, for example, in our field, the science of reading, but are you also evidence aligned to learning and teaching and implementation? Are you also evidence-based? Do you have evidence that the whatever you are using um, has evidence that it works with real students and real teachers in real classrooms, right? So let's take both of those. Let's take both of these and hold these as litmus tests to make sure that what we're investing in, whatever resources we're investing in, have both of these things. Ask those questions. So when we think about evidence alignment, the resources that I like to go to, I mean, this to me is, go to this right away. Um, if you're not familiar with this infographic, this is from International Dyslexic Association. I think it's a great way to understand kind of the why of the science of reading. It's, what are we teaching? How are we teaching it? And who's the beneficiaries of the science of reading research? If you don't have this infographic, here's a QR code that you can download. I'll just put this up for just a moment. I'm guessing most of you have this or are familiar with it. Really helps me understand, that first of all, that science of reading is not the actual thing we do. Science of reading is the research informing the structured literacy, right? Which is the approach that we take in practicing the science of reading. Okay. The other bodies of research that we look to, as I mentioned, science of reading, science of teaching, excuse me, science of learning, science of teaching. When it comes to the science of learning, um, let me just kind of share this with you kind of quickly. I this is in my book Science of Reading 3.0 that again I'll give you the QR code for this, but I borrowed very heavily from Deans for Impact. Some of you might be familiar with Deans for Impact, and also from Stanislaus Dehaan's How We Learn. So 6 principles from the science of learning. Number one, review. That, is key. And, I say here, students acquire knowledge by building on existing knowledge. I could just say humans. These are principles of the science of learning. So, we as humans acquire knowledge by building on existing knowledge. So lessons should deliberately connect the known to the new. So when we think about lesson design, that should be an attribute of lesson design. Number two, cognitive load or learning load can be impeded if we're provided with too much information at once. Some of you might teach kindergarten, or some of you might have a kindergartner at home. If you say to your kindergartner, put on your shoes, eat your banana, get your backpack, and go line up for the bus, what are they going to do? They're going to run out the door barefoot, right? I mean, that's just too much on their cognitive load. So, making sure that lessons are designed with a gradual release model. I do, we do, you do, which is sometimes I do, we do, you do. And lessons are designed with repeatable, replicable routines. Because if students know what to expect in a lesson, then their minds are freed from the process and they can focus on the learning. Attention and active engagement, that seems pretty self-explanatory. Attention is the gatekeeper of what we store and process. And so lessons need to be designed with purpose that is well known to all of us, right? We have a goal and a purpose, and we have multiple opportunities for response, active participation, and most importantly, application that feeds the purpose of the lesson. One of the things that I always reflect on in my own experience is when I came up as a teacher, especially during the National Reading Panel years, we had the pillars of reading. And I think calling them pillars was somewhat of a problem because then we designed our ELA block as pillars. We had our phonological awareness time, phonemic awareness time, our phonics time, our vocabulary time. You get the picture. We need to make sure that we're integrating, for example, foundational skill work with actual reading and writing. So kids understand that those skills feed a purpose, which is reading and writing. Practice could not be more important. At last year's International Dyslexic Association conference, some of you perhaps attended, that was a huge topic of conversation. That we're getting this ELA block really solid with instruction, but we also have to make sure that we're providing multiple opportunities for students to practice, and that during that practice, we are providing feedback that is specific and actionable, with opportunities for both affirmation and correction. And finally, that the environment obviously is safe, where students are valued and feel respected and have opportunities for incremental steps of success, right? So those are principles of the science of learning. Now, how do those overlay with the principles of instruction? Well, one of my favorite go-tos for principles of instruction is Barak Rosenshein. And I hope many of you are familiar with Barak Rosenshine's work. I consider it kind of the penultimate go-to for understanding the research on instruction, because what Brock Rosenshine did is he studied not just the cognitive science around instruction, but um, he also looked at what master teachers do. Master teachers who are getting great results with kids, getting great outcomes. What do they do? What do they do on a daily basis? And so this QR code will link you to an article that just summarizes the principles of instruction for and what Brock Rosenshine initially had more than 10, but here's his 10 principles of instruction. Now, as you look at these, you're going to see how they really map onto those principles of learning, as they should, because our teaching, the ultimate measure of our teaching, is our students' learning, right? So Rosenshine's principles of instruction include review, small steps of material to reduce that cognitive load, ask a lot of questions, opportunities for response, provide lots of models, that's that I do, right? Practice makes progress, check, correct errors, that's that feedback loop, obtain a high success rate, provide scaffolds, that independent practice, and finally, not only daily reviews as part of the lesson plan, as part of the lesson design, but monthly and weekly reviews as well. Okay, so this chart is just designed to, you don't have to spend a lot of time on this. This is just designed to say that the learning principles really do map onto Rosenshine's principles of instruction, right? So when we think about, this phase of implementation, are we making sure that we are enacting instruction that is aligned to structured literacy and the science of reading, but also science of learning, science of teaching, right? Are we integrating all of this? And frankly, that's because, we don't have all the time in the world, right? We want to make our instruction count. So let's make sure it's evidence aligned, right? What do we know? We know so much. Let's make sure we're paring down our teaching to make it efficient and effective, as efficient and effective as possible. And that the resources that we're choosing align with all of those sciences, right? So when we think about our resources, our courageous moves are to be a discerning consumer. There are several curriculum evaluation tools out there, and make sure that we know what those evaluation tools are using as their criteria. Okay? So make sure that we are looking at those curriculum resources and making sure that we're holding those high standards for evidence alignment, but also evidence studies. Does the publisher have actual evidence studies that show that the programs and resources work? Also, I've always encouraged people to, just don't pile on lots of resources. Sometimes we have to de-implement. Sometimes we need to pull weeds in order to plant flowers. Sometimes we have to give up some things that we're doing in order to make room for others. And let's make sure, if you're a courageous leader, choose materials that make your teachers' lives easier so that they can focus on their most important work. And also alignment, right? Making sure that across the tiers, there's consistency, because that consistency compounds. And when we think about consistency, what do I mean? The lessons are designed across tiers with that gradual release model, opportunities for response, and application. That the scope and sequence of skills is same across tiers of instruction, lots of opportunities for practice, lots of opportunities for feedback. There's that consistency of routines, repeatable, replicable routines. So we're not taxing our students' cognitive bandwidth. That's also helpful for us as teachers, frankly, to have consistency of routines. Consistency of language, clear, unambiguous instructional dialogue, consistent academic language across grades and across tiers, and data alignment that connects those tiers of instruction, pinpoints our students' needs, informs our groupings, and that the data rolls up so that we have visibility to everyone who's invested in the needs of our students, right? Okay, so there's a lot there in that initial implementation. So just real quickly, are your tiers of instruction, I want you to just think to yourself, are your tiers of instruction aligned in language, routines, scope, and sequence? And are you using resources that are both evidence aligned and evidence-based? So while you ponder those two questions, I am going to check the chat to see if we have any questions that I can answer before we move on to our next phase. Jenny, Kim, do you see any questions
I
in
was
there?
just going to say, no, I do not see any questions right now.
All right, so I'm going to move on just but in the interest of time, I'm going to move on because I see our time is ticking away. But I encourage you, as you think about your resources, think about tiers of instruction, alignment, and resources that are both evidence aligned and evidence-based. All right, so we're moving on to full implementation. So courageous leader moves in the full implementation phase. First of all, we want to continue with that vision, right? Make your vision visible always, always, always. And this is where we as courageous leaders in that full implementation, this is where, by the way, everybody's using the resources we have chosen, everybody's in the professional learning, everyone is fully invested in the implementation. So this is where we are inspecting what we expect. This is also where we're keeping a pulse on the school culture. You know, is everyone, are we moving, is the needle moving in the right direction? Is our school culture, are we still committed to the initiative? And are we being reflective? Are we being reflective on the initiative? So let me just elevate this, inspecting what we expect. Are we using those curricular resources with integrity? Remember, I said there's a difference between fidelity and integrity, right? Are we using those curriculum resources with integrity? Are we implementing evidence-aligned practices with precision? Are we teaching with precision? Are we using that collective data collection? Are we using that cooperative data collection and analysis process where we collect the data, analyze it together, use that data together? Am I, as a leader, giving my staff support that they need in place to be continuously successful? And are we getting the outcomes that we need so that our gaps are closing? So am I inspecting what we are expecting collectively for this implementation to be working? And, you know, we need to provide that support because teaching is one of the most cognitively complex professions. You know, there's always uncertainty as to what works in various schools and diverse communities with unique groups of students. And that's what makes, as I said earlier, teaching this profession based on continual inquiry and expansion of repertoire and knowledge through practice, right? That's what makes it a beautiful profession of continual learning. So while we are inspecting what we expect, we're also continuously, you know, reviewing ourselves. How are we reflective? How are we thinking through, you know, are we engaged? Are we thriving in the initiative? And what are our next steps as we continue to grow? What shifts need to be made? Are we being reflective as we review on the initiative? Okay, I'm going to move through this because I know we're short on time here. So the last phase is that sustainability phase. As I mentioned, to me, this deserves its own attention because it really is important to think about how are we sustaining an initiative. And that really is making sure that we are committed to we have a long-term commitment to continuous growth. So as a leader, what are some things I want to do? I want to make sure that we are committed to hiring, training, and retaining the very best. I want to make sure to delegate to and invest in future leaders. And I want to remember that we are progress, not perfection, right? We have to make sure that every day we're making progress, and that's our expectation, that we're making progress and we celebrate the progress that we're making, right? All right, so we reflect on all of these phases that we've gone through this morning together, and I want you to think about this. I want you to think about where are you on your own journey as you chose to come to this session this morning for a reason. So where are you on your own journey as you think about your courageous leadership? What is your next step as a courageous leader? What questions do you have that still remain? And I will be giving you my contact information. So as you think about your own journey, um, are there questions that you might have that I might be able to help you with? Aaron has a question. Do you have any recommendations for larger school systems? Yeah, 8,000 teachers. For sustainability where there is a constant shift in teachers. Yeah. This is one of the biggest, I think, biggest challenges we have is when there's a constant shift in teachers. So one of the recommendation that I have for you is make sure uh, that we are keeping track of everything, that we are uh, keeping track of everything that we're doing as an initiative, that we are keeping records of everything we're doing, that we have a mentorship program in place so that when we have new staff in place, that new staff have mentors within every grade level, so that we have a record of what we're doing, so that mentors are in place to bring new staff up to speed on what we're doing, so that commitment will carry on through our mentor teachers. That's the best way I've seen to make sure that there's continuity with an initiative. It isn't easy. There is no easy answer, but that's the one I think that is the strongest. The other thing is leadership. If we have leadership continuity, that is ideal, but I know that is also oftentimes a challenge as well. But mentorship is really the key. I also want to encourage you to think about this. This is something that Terry Nolan and I put together because I want you to think about, when you have a symposium like this, you're investing in minutes, right? Minutes. I call this professional development minutes. The learning comes through moments where you're able to work together, reading and analyzing and collaborating together. The momentum comes when you're investing in leadership growth, right, as leaders. But it really takes the minutes and the moments and the momentum for transformational literacy to happen. So this is just the minutes that we're spending together, which contributes to holistically your transformational literacy um, initiatives. But this is part of it, but it certainly isn't the whole answer, right? However, I encourage all of you to remember that, as you think about yourself as a leader, think about yourself as a transformational leader. Think about yourself as someone who influences people to think and to speak in such a way that makes a positive impact on lives, because that's the business you're in. We're in the business of impacting lives. It's really important work. It's so important work. And I thank you for the work that you do, because really at the end of the day, this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to make sure that all of our students are readers. And what would it be like, right? How would that transform our classrooms and our schools and our districts and our states and our nation and the world, right? And that's what we're striving for. And I thank you for always striving toward that, never giving up on that. That's courageous. That's super courageous. All right. I was on a podcast with Anna Geiger, if any of you follow her, talking about implementation science. I mentioned that there's a QR code here for the book Science of Reading 3.0. One thing I love about this book is I was able to ask 18 major experts in the field to contribute essays to this book, and they all said yes. And there's some familiar faces to those of you, I'm sure, in the science of reading world. This was really about, I call this widening the lens on literacy. Here's the QR code, but you can also just get it from our website. It's a free download. And there's some wonderful essays in there from some people that I admire tremendously, and I hope that you'll have an opportunity to take a look at that sometime. All right, thank you so much for joining me this morning. And oh, I forgot to put my contact information. My contact information is lstewart@95percentgroup.com. If you want to reach out to me, lstewart@95percentgroup.com. The handout should be uploaded onto the site. So